Greetings. On behalf of the 18 denominations that make up the North Carolina Council of Churches, I'm Susanna Tuttle, Director of the Council's Eco-Justice Connection Initiatives. It is in prayer and with blessing that I welcome everyone to Day 4 of our 2022 Critical Issues Seminar, The Ties That Bind Democracy. Many of you have joined us for the first part of the week for presentations from the Carter Center, focusing on the work of maintaining confidence in the integrity of our elections and ensuring the safety of those who exercise their right to vote. We heard from the Southern Coalition for Social Justice about why redistricting matters and what happens when access to the polls is suppressed or voting districts become less than competitive. And the North Carolina Voters for Clean Elections presented on why our state courts are vital to protecting constitutional rights and protections, and how our courts impact our daily lives and what's at stake for North Carolinians. All of these sessions and today's and tomorrow's will be uploaded to our YouTube channel, and we hope you will continue to review the material with your congregations, families, colleagues, and communities. Today, our featured speakers are Marcus Bass and the Reverend Marcus Fairley. Together, they will be sharing about the very important work they do. But first, it is my honor to share a few things about these incredible leaders presenting to us today. Marcus Bass serves as the Deputy Director for the North Carolina Black Alliance, an organization serving as advocate for North Carolina's historically Black institutions of faith, education, and civic service across the state. In 2020, the North Carolina Black Alliance launched Safe Voter NC, the leading resource for voter safety and protection for underrepresented Black and Brown residents, providing the most recent shifts in election administration for North Carolina. Marcus has served as statewide campaign director for Democracy North Carolina, where he led their long-term redistricting effort, coordinated millennial and faith-based voter engagement, and served as a key messenger for the organization. Marcus is the former board chair of Common Cause North Carolina and is currently the chairman of the board of directors for the North Carolina State Voices affiliate, Blueprint North Carolina. Marcus has been featured on various media outlets and publications, providing insight on Southern and college voter engagement. Marcus is a member of Alpha Phi Alpha Fraternity Incorporated and is also the founder and co-director of Camp Lead Up, a summer leadership institute focused on facilitating the transition for minority middle school students to high school through academic support, cultural enrichment, leadership development, civic engagement, and community service. We also have the Reverend Marcus Fairley, who is a native of Albemarle, North Carolina. Reverend Fairley attended Hood Theological Seminary, where he found his passion for social justice gospel and hope for the plethora of disparities faced by people of color through Black liberation theology. Reverend Fairley has experience on a national and state level from NAACP in the capacity of civic engagement and faith, and is employed as the Voter Involvement and Constituent Engagement Program Associate for North Carolina Black Alliance. Reverend Fairley is very active with the state of North Carolina, serving as the second vice moderator of the Rowan Baptist Association, board member of the General Baptist State Convention of North Carolina, governing board member for the North Carolina Council of Churches, and he will complete Lot Carey's Pastors Under 40 Thriving in Ministry program this year. Reverend Fairley is the proud pastor of the historic St. Luke Missionary Baptist Church. When he is not spreading the gospel or spearheading initiatives to liberate people of color, he enjoys traveling with his lovely bride, listening to music, and locating the nearest beach to relax. It is an honor to be with both of you today, and we are grateful to have you with us to discuss the challenges of voter suppression and the upsurge in attempts to restrict free and fair access to the polls, with special attention to consequences for minority voters. I hand it to both of you. Thank you for being here.
Thank you, Susanna, and to everyone that is here today. What a pleasure and honor it is for us to be here for this occasion with the longstanding history that we have had with the council, as well as the work that we do across the state of North Carolina. I'm honored to have our deputy director with us, Marcus Bass, on today. And there is so much information that we want to share with you all. We're glad that this is a recording so that we can share it out across the state with tools and resources that we have and things that we want to talk about today to help us as we maneuver and overcome the challenges of voter suppression. And so I'm more than excited and overjoyed to share with you the resources and tools that we have put together for today's presentation. And I'm this time going to turn it over to our Deputy Director to begin our presentation.
I want to say good afternoon to everyone, and thank you for this invitation. The Council of Churches and the work of bringing together the ties of our country known as democracy is a very heavy lift, especially in this moment. We have witnessed in the past week over 30 deaths, from churches to grocery stores to schools. And the policy change and the shift that we all know needs to be made seems to be falling upon deaf ears by those that we elect in office. I want us to first just take a moment of silence followed by a collective deep breath, because so many times as individuals that are in this work, individuals in communities of faith leading these conversations and these experiences, day by day, we have to go from one thing to the next, and we don't get a chance to just reflect and exhale. And as quick as technology makes it for us to be in communication and start the business, if we're not careful, we are going to lose focus. And so I very much so want to start off with just a moment of silence, and then I'm going to ask us to take a collective deep breath. Now, if we go inhale together through our nose and out through our mouth, in, out. And I want you to actually make the sound of breathing. I want to hear the air. I want you to hear the air come through your nose again and out through your mouth. And I want us to try this one more time. In through our nose and exhale. Now I'm Baptist, so we're gonna have to do that one more time to make sure that we're centered and grounded. It just feels right. Let's breathe in. Hold it. And let's breathe out together. In the time that me and Marcus have today, and I'm fortunate to have someone like Marcus as a colleague in this work, because for a long time I grew up in the church and was always amazed at how the church was able to bring people together of all various communities, all various races, all various economic backgrounds, and under one room and one space, create commonality, at the very least for an hour, hour and a half. And so I respect any individual that steps up to that obligation. And as pastor himself, he's done that. Also, as board member of the Council of Churches, he has stepped beyond the role of being a clergy leader and his own shepherd of his own flock, and is now helping support the continuation of this moral imperative to fight beyond just ourselves, but be in community with other churches and church leaders around this effort. This morning, Reverend Fairley had me in a meeting with the General Baptist State Convention as they prepare to decide what to do in this moment of violence and shootings, and to hear and see Reverend Fairley advocate there, to see his work in the North Carolina Black Alliance. I know his church is fortunate, and I am fortunate to have a moment to present with him together. When we are together, the organization calls us Team Marcus. So I hope we give due diligence to that moniker of a name and what we're going to share with you. There's so much uncertainty in this country today. I think one of the things that we're always grappling with as we turn on CNN and Fox News and MSNBC is the major challenges to democracy, the threat to democracy. And especially in this moment of uncertainty, these uncertain times create situations of fear and grief for all of us. But I want you to know that as communities of faith, we have always wrestled with the lived experience of being political prisoners of some sort. And so when we approach this work of democracy from a theological or from a religious mindset, we are centering the struggle of bringing religion to the masses in the same way that democracy has struggled to be brought to the masses. And so what better group of people to talk about engaging the vote, engaging the voter, and using democracy as a means to create common good than this space. And so we don't count it any way ununique to the Black Alliance, that role of communities of faith. And in our work in this network of institutions across North Carolina, historically in the South, we have seen institutions, primarily institutions of faith, have a large impact in our work and in our world. This slide is not cooperating with me, but if it was, I would be able to share with you the different constituent bases that we serve in the North Carolina Black Alliance, primarily the institution of faith and Black churches across the state, and really individuals that understand the plight of the Black community that are parishioners of churches across North Carolina. We help convene and provide spaces for training for these institutions of faith to do GOTV work. And you'll see a little bit more behind what that looks like as we get into the presentation. Also, we work along the lines of our Black colleges. As we saw in our history, from the emancipation of slaves came, and even before emancipation, the Black church sprung up, and immediately out of that sprung Black institutions, academic institutions. I think about Shaw University being founded in the immediacy, years immediately after emancipation, the end of the Civil War. And these institutions, just like institutions of faith, have been communities of inspiration, of education, and advocacy and community. We also work with our civic and social organizations. I know Reverend Fairley mentioned in his bio the work of the NAACP. We also work with the Black fraternities and sororities in North Carolina. We work with other social and civic organizations like the Links, the 100 Black Men, and all of these groups, along with our Black elected officials, we help to coordinate an understanding of issues, not just democratic issues, but the interconnectedness of the issues of political engagement, crime and justice, education, access to healthcare. And in this moment, we can't look at these things as isolated. A lot of times people have the conversation in certain communities around voting or economic advancement. Those two things are interconnected. Our health is interconnected. Our education is interconnected. And we like to make sure that these institutions and these groups understand that interconnectedness and work together to create solutions. Our organization is chaired by Senator Valerie Foushee. We have a vice chair for the North Carolina Black Alliance, former Wake County School Board chair, and now current superintendent of Warren County Public Schools, Keith Sutton. And Commissioner Viola Harris is our immediate past chair and secretary of the board of directors. We also have a huge number of other individuals serving on our board and on subcommittees as a whole. Let's get into this conversation for this evening. I want us to think of this slide as a timeline. And this time of 518 years of this American experience, all of us have not experienced the same freedoms. This period of time of 364 years that's indicated in Black here, let's consider that the time that is referred to as chattel slavery. Now, for us, we understand, and a lot of folks may not, the 1619 Project shed light on the fact that African Americans first came to this land as slaves during the year 1619. But in fact, African Americans were on this landmass long before 1619. There's documented evidence of trade routes, intercontinental trade routes, and communities of African descent had a rich history of going back and forth to this landmass before the documented history and the insertion of African Americans as slaves on this continent. But this period of 364 years of documented history in America from the 1500s to 1865 is really a time period of darkness for our democracy. Yes, there was a right to vote, but it wasn't a right to vote, not even for all Americans. Women did not have the right to vote of any color, of ethnic descent. Any individual that wasn't a land-owning white male did not have the right to vote. So when we look at 518 years of American participation, we've been suppressing the vote longer than we have been enfranchising voters to engage in a real, true form of democratic engagement. And so the trauma of 364 years of oppression and violence is now attributed to the political process by means of laws and legislation that have hindered the vote. And we'll get through that in the presentation. In this timeline, when we look at this 364 years of chattel slavery up until the Emancipation Proclamation, in this short time period between 1865 to 2022, we've seen massive growth in communities that at once time were considered property. This time period in red here on the chart is very significant because from 1865 to 1898, contrary to popular belief, North Carolinians were thriving outside of the construct of slavery. We were working together, building businesses together, playing together in a real sense, and all of a sudden that shifted in the year 1898 in particular. And the outgrowth of what happened in that shift, we're still dealing with the aftermath today. The destruction of Black Wall Street comes at a time period where Black communities across North Carolina that were thriving, all of a sudden were burned. Individuals were moved out of community. We went from 100% participation of the Black community in voting, and I want to put a caveat there because then again, it was still just Black men that were able to vote. 100% participation immediately after slavery, building Black businesses, building Black institutions. And then in 1898, as we all know, the destruction or the end of Reconstruction marked the beginning of a new process of democracy by way of a bifurcated democracy. Everybody knows the story of Jim Crow and how Jim Crow politics didn't start necessarily as federal legislation, but started as local legislation, legalizing voter suppression in ways in which folks had to count jelly beans or recite the Constitution. Those evidence of voter suppression emerged literally 20 years after individuals were freed from slavery. That trauma is still affecting our democracy today. Right after emancipation and the end of Reconstruction, we have a period of relatively 100 years before we saw an advancement in the Black community again by way of the civil rights movement. I want us to note one thing: the size of this gap of time here in red and the size of the gap of time in purple. This size of the gap of time in purple in this whole span of this bar on the slide represents the civil rights movement from 1955 to 1968. That is the civil rights movement in the grand scheme of our history. Just a blip on the radar that was such a mega transformational shift that we are still using some of the lessons. We're still hearing from some of the voices, and we're still dealing with some of the aftermath of the assassinations of our leaders during that moment in time. So every movement of progress for the Black community has ended in death, deconstruction, being killed in spaces for merely just trying to survive or assert our voting rights. The trauma that you are seeing in these small periods of time still has impact in our democracy today. And now this last blip of time, I think is interesting if you're noticing the pattern here, the election of Barack Obama all the way up until the shooting death of Trayvon Martin, bookend, and now we're in 10 years since the shooting of Trayvon Martin. If we could just think about how long that has been, we are in another blip of time that we see progress met with violence. I know a lot of us have empathy for communities. Some of us don't have the ability to take off this trauma. We can try to vacation it away or self-care it away, but the lived experience of Black people in this democratic process and for the greater communities of color is one of destruction and devastation. This fragile democracy that we are in right now has intentionally been fragile. It's been intentionally handicapped. And our experience in this country has been met with fierce violence since the inception of this American philosophy on Turtle Island. I want us to view this picture in particular. This did not come from some new age cartoonist. This is a depiction, as well as this depiction, from the News and Observer. If we go back to our slide deck, the previous slide, you'll see the year 1898. If you look at this newspaper, you'll see the year 1898. The News and Record at this time was owned by a man by the name of Josephus Daniels, who, as a matter of fact, lived in Raleigh. Right now, if you are familiar with Raleigh, North Carolina, his home is currently owned by Shaw University. Years later, they were able to acquire his home, but it is right behind McDonald's, right in the middle of downtown. But Josephus Daniels, as owner of the News and Observer, was a staunch white supremacist. And immediately in the aftermath of seeing thriving Black communities, seeing individuals come together and build Black Wall Streets, they began to use the newspaper as a form of misinformation or disinformation. This is the front page of the same periodical that is in print publication today. And you see this monstrosity of a caricature of a Black hand grasping seemingly unknowing white individuals or residents. This was used to stoke fear, and not just any type of fear, but the fear that would overturn the political progress of individuals that were just freed from slavery less than 30 years from the time that this was printed. And so when we see individual opportunities of individuals that have other ideologies for America, and then we see the aftermath, the Wilmington Massacre, where because of this print publication, individuals in Wilmington, North Carolina, who at one point in time were building a fusion movement together, begin to see themselves as being pit against the Black community. And this rise of violence in our community, we are still dealing with the aftermath of today. Now, I try my very best to hide the political imagery here because I want you to really get the impression of these two pictures. This was 1898, the destruction of a Black community that was engaging politically and mirrored across the country in different areas. And now here we are in 2021 with this insurrection at the Capitol. We can act as if we don't know our history, and folks can act as if they don't recognize where we've come. But it's interesting how some of the same stances, the same poses, and the same arguments are being used, the same propaganda models or methods, maybe not the same pictures, but it all ends up with the same end result: a democracy hanging on by a thread, and us as community of faith trying to understand how our moral compass is being politicized by the right and the left while our lives are at stake. They're coming into our churches with a political agenda and killing us. And that's not just a voter suppression issue that hurts the Black community. It's an issue that harms all of us as communities of faith and as this democracy. The struggle for education, the struggle for housing rights, the struggle for humanity is a interconnected struggle with our democracy. And as we see individuals throughout history, and we see individuals today still dealing with some of the same issues, it's not a matter of an agenda. It's a matter of a willingness to see the humanity in individuals that have had to consistently fight just to thrive in our society. The freedom that we want to see in this country will not happen unless we truly liberate ourselves, starting first with how we treat those individuals that America has used to get to this moment. That will be our indigenous population, our Black women, and our larger Black community. Now, I want to transition here as we go to Reverend Fairley's portion of the presentation from this historical narrative to now this current narrative. I love these maps because it helps us show in a very quick clip from Carolina demography where our populations reside in North Carolina. The top map shows the majority of our Hispanic population or our Latinx population and the areas of North Carolina in which they reside. We also see at the bottom left, the Black community. I want you to look at the regions of the state and the mirror of relationship and location to these two populations. When we think about Eastern North Carolina, we think about agriculture, we think about access to the land. In a lot of cases, these same fields and farms are connected to the families of the plantation owners in these same communities. As a matter of fact, in certain parts of North Carolina, you have individuals that still reside within 10 to 20 miles from the slave holding lands in which their forefathers worked. We still have individuals that hold the last name of the plantation owner, and they're running for office in these local governments and have exchanged a system of chattel slavery for a system of mass incarceration. While some of these areas of North Carolina, particularly in the east, have water just as horrible as Flint, they are not seeing an investment in infrastructure, not just water, but broadband internet. These parts of North Carolina are being choked out. And regardless of who is in elected office, the standard of living and the quality of life for these residents continues to decline. And we also see in Western North Carolina, far west, the largest segments of our white population have some of the same experiences and living conditions. When we talk about situations of poverty in the far east and far west, there's no reason why we should let the subtle differences being used historically separate us when we know the fact that if we work together as we did in the previous years of engagement, that we end up getting more from our democracy. So when we look at the elements of voter suppression and going back to this earlier picture of the insurrection, and I want to make sure we think about this very carefully, the ties that bound individuals starting the Wilmington coup. When we look at the January 6th insurrection, one of the few state flags that flew during the insurrection was the North Carolina flag. And when we look at the symbology there, and then we look at these communities that have not shifted since slavery, there's no reason why we have voter suppression in some of the same counties where we're seeing historically African-American communities being under marginalized. This map that you're seeing now helps us transition from the demographic map to actually seeing in 2016, the counties that had the most severe evident voter suppression. And again, the southeastern part of our states in particular saw some of the most egregious restrictions of early voting dates. They saw a restriction in locations. And even though we're far away from 2016 from a year standpoint, understanding the fact that these areas are still going to be historic indicators for voter suppression and harm, not just because of 2016, but because of the other maps that we've seen and because of this history of voter suppression or really racist intimidation and white supremacy in North Carolina. It always helps to also show the disaster counties during hurricane season. Folks like to see more so to the areas that are going to be severely harmed, potentially because of hurricanes. And here you see the counties that are heavily flood prone. Again, most of these are African-American counties in the eastern part of the state.
Thank you, Director Bass. At this time, I want to jump in right here as we talk about the upsurge and all of this history that we have just received and what we've heard and how it's still going on even today, how we respond to it and what the consequences look like for our communities that not only will affect the Black and Brown communities, but will also affect us all ultimately. And some of these barriers to voting, there's several barriers to voting, but some of the ones that we want to highlight today, of course, the one that I had to put on here first was what we like to call the big lie, the voter ID requirements, where they're trying to say, politicians will say that there's fraud in voting, but we know that there's no fraud in voting, and we met it and beat it several times right here in the state of North Carolina as we continue to fight against voter ID requirements here in our state. Also, there's some things that we, of course, can lift up, like voter roll purges, which was originally implemented to move duplicate names that were on voter rolls and also those that have deceased. But of course, again, politicians use this to their advantage to eliminate millions of eligible voters that were able to vote and eliminate them from the polls. And so those are things that we still fight against even on today. The closing of polling places and the reduction of polling places, which heavily affect those that cannot get out within their communities to go vote when there's time for elections. That's a major barrier to voting. Reduce early voting. As we talk about faith and how we respond and the things that we are lifting up here, many counties, even still here in North Carolina, do not have Sunday voting. Here in Rowan County, we have to fight with the County Board of Elections for Sunday voting every time there's an election. And we all show up to make sure that they don't take that right away from us, because we do things like the Souls to the Polls, which we'll get into here shortly. But every time there's a reduction in an ability to be able to get access to the polls, that is a barrier to voting. And so not only that, reduce hours. We have the shortest amount of hours even on Sunday, but we're still fighting to make sure that we're at least open on Sunday to give people the opportunity to vote. When we talk about things such as lack of funding for elections, this gets into the thing where we talk about the ballot counts, machines overheating, not being enough staff. And here, even during this primary that we just came out of right here in North Carolina, in counties like Alamance, we had workers down there where the drive-up voting was not necessarily working. The bell that you're supposed to run over, nobody was coming out. People were waiting for upwards to 10 and 15 minutes just to be able to vote. These are things that we're still faced within our communities of color to make sure that people have access to the polls. And these are things that we have to make sure that we're fighting against. Creation of a large local offices to dilute the minority vote, having larger districts so that we can kind of dilute the minority vote. Those are things and tactics that are barriers to voting. And something that I always thought was interesting was the lack of language access. We know that we push the English language, but we have many people in our communities that do not speak the English language, and we don't have translators at polling sites and polling places to even encourage them to be able to know what it is. They may show up at the wrong polling site and are not able to vote, and nobody there to correct them and help them to get to the place where they need. So those are votes that we miss out on. And we've been seeing this, as Director Bass has said, throughout our history. But what is the moral conscience and the moral response to this? And we've seen it here in North Carolina in a major way when we can just think of people that we can talk about here that we've listed, leaders of faith that have really been a staple in our community and across our state to raise their voices and to get all of us encouraged and involved in how do we stop and eliminate voter suppression. First name, of course, that comes to mind is familiar to all of us could be Bishop Barber. And we know what Bishop Barber's impact was on this state with the creation of Moral Mondays, where we came together every Monday in Raleigh to lift our voices and raise our voices to the injustices and the legislative and challenge the policy that were put in place to make sure that our people, all of us, had access to the polls. Out of the Moral Mondays grew, of course, what we are all known to know today as the historic Thousands on Jones Street, where we convene every February in Raleigh to make sure that we lift up and highlight the people's agenda, which helps us to push and promote policy change, legislation, and things of that nature, that we not only can access to the polls with things that Director Bass has talked about already, when we talk about environmental justice that I've seen in the chat, when we talk about criminal justice reform, when we're talking about being able to have some type of rehabilitation for those that are coming out of prison, or those that are trying to vote that are now felons that have come out, that have recovered and done the things that they need to do to make sure that they're able to vote again. Not only Bishop Barber, but when you think of leaders in our state, such as Dr. Greg Moss, who was the architect behind our Souls to the Polls efforts, creating churches to come together and galvanize. There's a picture that we were trying to locate, Director Bass and myself, where he's on his motorcycle going across the state of North Carolina to churches, getting people galvanized to make sure that they go out and vote on Sundays, where we would leave our places of worship on Sunday and go straight to the polls to make sure that our people are politically engaged. And these are not only preachers and pastors and leaders of the cause, but they have political acumen that causes them to make sure that we talk about the social justice of Jesus Christ and what that means for our congregations and our communities, to make sure that we're engaged in the political process. It is our our right to make sure that we have an access to the polls, free and fair access to the polls, without any hindrance or without any barriers. And so these leaders, such as Joy Joseph Johnson, Nelson Johnson, Ben Chavis, North Carolina Senator Paul Lowe, these are names of people that have shown us what it looks like to not only stand behind the sacred desk to proclaim the gospel, but also to get out in the streets like Jesus did and make sure that we're walking aside these that are considered the least of these, to make sure that we're lifting them up and elevating them to a place where they have equal access to health. So when we go ahead and talk about the consequences as we roll into that, we look at things like this conversation, this imaginary leak that came about Roe versus Wade, and these things that are coming out. These are healthcare crises and things that are coming up in our, not only in our communities, but across our nation. And we have to make sure that we are speaking truth to power, that we're raising our voices, that we're elevating the resources that are needed in our communities. Things like the lack of milk for children and formula. These things are so tough on not only our communities of color, but they affect all of us, because all of our children need milk. All of our children need the formula that they need in order to have the nurture and the basic needs that they need in this life. So when we talk about things about environmental justice that Director Bass lifted up, healthy drinking water, these are things that happen right here in North Carolina. We don't think that we thought the Flint crisis was something major. Many of us sent water to Flint. We still need to send water to those areas here in North Carolina that are affected as well, that don't have healthy drinking water and things of that nature. These are things that we're fighting against every day. The education system, where classrooms are overcrowded, where teachers are teaching to classrooms upwards to sizes of 50. We have 900 vacancies in our school systems where teachers can't even get replaced. How can you replace 900 when you can't even get a substitute teacher for a regular working week? We have real crises that we have to raise up in our communities. And one of the things that I'll quote our director here, he says, a broken democracy creates a broken government. That's why it's bigger than just communities of color or our Black community. It affects us all when our democracy is broken. We have that broken governmental system. So we can't even talk about, and I mentioned it earlier, the felony voting rights being restored. When people have come out of prison, they've served their time, they paid their fines and penalties and did everything rightfully so, they should be able to be restored in their voting rights. And one of the major things for us to think about here, and when we talk about the housing crisis and the economic crisis, jobs and minimum wage not even being raised, these are things that not only transcend color, race, socioeconomic status, but also class and gender. And so it affects everyone on this call, and it also affects those that are in our communities and in our families. And these are things that we have to make sure that we're raising up to say, hey, this is what we do. So how do we combat some of this stuff? How do we respond to some of this stuff? We have several things that we put in place to make sure that we implement things like voter safety and protection. There's voter intimidation. Since the January 6th insurrection, there have been voter intimidation that happens across this country, particularly down east, and even as close as Rowan County, where you have people that ride with certain flags and things of that nature to try to have voter intimidation within our precincts. And we have to make sure that everyone has free and fair access to vote. So we want to make sure that we create safe sites in over all 100 of our counties to make sure that everyone has the ability and feel that they can vote in a safe manner.
That's absolutely right, Marcus. And we are excited. Even tomorrow, you're going to hear directly from one of the leaders across the state, the executive director of Blueprint North Carolina, Serena Sebring, who's going to talk to you a little bit more about how to create these safe sites. We're here to set the context for why these elements are important. The history that we just went through and the current reality of the fight back needs an engagement of all of our communities. The elements of voter safety, the elements of election protection and early vote advocacy all have to work hand in hand in a tandem to make sure that we are truly making sure that everyone has access, every ballot is counted and cast, and that everyone is able to do so safely. One of the things that we like to produce in the Black Alliance is information for voters to make sure that they are making the most educated attempt to vote possible. And we say educated by creating a plan for voting, actually sharing with them the 6 steps to register and vote online. Right now, even though we love going out with clipboards, this younger generation of demographic that doesn't live in the same place from year to year needs ways that they can just very quickly at the click of a button, get access to how to change their voter registration. There's a lot of families that are moving from rural parts of the state or urban parts of the state and all points in between, and making sure that we are up to date, especially in Black and brown communities, with this information is very important. In the midst of COVID-19 and even after, some folks are going to think that voting by mail is the best way to vote. And that interaction of being able to process a registration for someone that is voting or registering to vote by mail or registering to vote absentee rather can be very confusing. And so we really like to make sure that we are breaking down in very simple bites the information, because what we don't want to do is have voters suppressed because of lack of information. We can make sure that we stand up the effort at the polls to protect them. And especially in light of what we've seen this past week, we know what that's going to make, or what that is going to take. But we also want to make sure that folks realize that they have multiple options. Before we even take them to the polls en masse, we can have them vote by mail. We can have them engage in areas of political participation that are safe. We can't forget our college students right now. We do a lot of our work. We have a website, safevoternc.org, and there we have information up to date for all counties across the state around how to vote and cast your ballot. But also we have information for our college students. We mentioned in the beginning, we work primarily with our historically Black college students. And here, at a click of a button, any individual that attends a institution in North Carolina that's an HBCU, they can get information about how to register online, how to register by mail, how to vote in person, or how to vote absentee. In the midst of what we have lost since COVID, we're seeing a number of college students not voting anymore. And as much as we love to go on college campuses, we are always not the best messengers on the college campuses. But that peer-to-peer engagement and providing online opportunities, getting in the spaces where they are and meeting the need through technology, along with the in-person traditional engagement, we've seen as a major element to help. Just sharing the website again with you, safevoternc.org. And also, we can't end without talking about the midterm election. I don't know, you've probably seen these numbers already. Historic turnout in the midterm with approximately 1.4 million ballots cast, 20% of the voting population in North Carolina turned out. This is the highest turnout that we've had since even 2018. And so we're turning out year after year in larger numbers, and we still have more work to do. Midterm elections are typically low turnout elections compared to presidential election cycles. But if what we're seeing in this country is any indication of the political forces that are at play in our safety and in our lives, we're going to need to make sure that every community comes out and casts a ballot in the election cycle. This information is showing you exactly which, from the early voting standpoint, which ballots were cast by Republican, Democrat, and nonpartisan. It's just a snapshot. Again, we wanted to make sure we provided the most accurate information we had on nonpartisan voter engagement. And I'm going to turn it over now to Reverend Fairley to close this out in what we think are specific ways that you can join with us and the Council of Churches in this steps moving forward.
Absolutely. Thank you, Director Bass. One of the ways, and I see one of the questions in the chat, was how do you get involved in the Souls to the Polls efforts? I put my email in the chat there. We do things such as regional clusters with our faith engagement team. And so we will not only kick off this, but something in this similar fashion we'll be doing before the general election is our faith summit. And so one of the things that we would like to highlight, especially every time we get the opportunity to talk about it, is key voting deadlines and making sure that we're marking these deadlines to know when we can appoint people to the polls. If they do not know, make sure we also give them resources like North Carolina State Board of Election to get this information off on their county board of elections, so they'll know exactly where it is that they need to go vote. But as we're talking about so suppose if you'll go to the next slide, Director Bass, one of the other things that we had down here at the bottom, when we're talking about our social polls, we partner with, as Director Bass said, groups like Forward Justice, NAACP, and I also seen that Reverend Pridgeon did a write-up with Jennifer to make sure that they talked about the massacre that happened in Buffalo as well as Texas as well, and that's some of the things that we're working on now when a joint statement with the General Baptist State Convention, and we're going to put out an action. The action may be next Friday is our hope. And as we're looking, you all look out for emails, and I'll share it with Susanna and the rest of the team so that we can get it out to everyone to make sure that we're there. It's an in-person thing. We're trying to, hopefully we'll be able to do it in Raleigh at one of our elementary schools to make sure we have like a gathering of people to call out a prayer visual and a moment of silence. But ways that we can get involved, look out, follow our Facebook. I'm talking about our Facebook page, our website. As Director Bass said, we'll also put that there in the chat. There's a faith link as well. So if you want to sign up to become a partner, you want to get engaged, get involved, all you have to do is sign up to our email list there, or either email me directly, and you can be a part of the work that we're doing with the faith team.
Perfect. So I thank you so much for your time. I saw a lot of folks here that I haven't seen in a long time, and I'm just thankful and grateful to be in community with you. And if you have any questions, we'll feel free to ask those at this time. And we're going to put links in the chat. And I see one already. Are you working throughout North Carolina or just in a certain part of the state? We are everywhere the Black community is. And so we have regional coordinators that are set up in 6 different regions across the state of North Carolina. That's how we are divided. In each of those areas, we pull together what we are calling county tables. These county tables are coordinated meetings of the leadership, lay leadership in these different counties talking about these issues. One of the things that I hate seeing, and as you all have seen, is the ebb and flow of activism that happens after every protest. And one of the things that we have to do is stop pitting protest against politics. Protests are political. And one of the things that I think we need to do in our communities are making sure we connect the dots. Every action needs a meeting. And this coordinated actions across the state help us stay in community. One of the things we like to do in our county table meetings is let folks know this is a long-term fight. We can't just get it at the end of every protest or at the end of every election, but through every single revolution of political process and political protest, we're able to create change. And we do that on a local level through our county tables. And if you're in a part of the state and wondering if county table is in your area, just let us know. And for a lot of us that are doing this work, if we don't have your county in our region, you're connected to us through our faith work. You can be connected to us through our HBCU work. You can be connected through us through our Black Summit, our annual Black Summit event. So even if we're not in your backyard, there's tons of other ways to join with us. We just had 1,700 individuals virtually with us last week for our Divine Nine Legislative Day. And we love to coordinate opportunities for individuals to talk to politicians, because a lot of times by ourselves, they won't listen.
Yeah, there's a couple other questions that I see coming up, Director Bass. One of the things that we're talking about here, yes, we do, due to COVID, we haven't done a lot of canvassing and door knocking, but we did do door hangers, and we do like what we call just drops. And so also there's ways to get involved with that work as well. But yes, I'm of the mindset that canvassing still works. And so as we're looking on the back end of COVID-19, we can definitely do that. There also was a question about those that are voting in the jails. We've had some heavy work done when we partnered with the NAACP out in Statesville, where they were able to go in the jails and talk to the sheriffs to make sure that they were able to get ballots into eligible people that were in the jails. That is a major, major heavy lift. Also on a statewide level, former President Dr. T. Anthony Spearman lifted that up. Also former president here, he lifted that up as well. And so that is a push that we continue to push, and some work that we continue to do, because everyone that needs to vote needs to vote. We need all those ballots to count. And so that is something that we definitely can lift up, and a program that we can definitely resurge that's already in place.
In 2020, we knocked on 75,000 doors across the state. This previous election cycle, because of COVID-19, we were very careful about putting our teams in person. We do a form of deep canvassing where we're calling through and setting up meetings with individuals in community. We're holding focus groups right now as we speak across the state. And in this previous election cycle, in the primary, we have contacted 150,000 voters across the state through our volunteer phone bank efforts. I'm seeing folks, yes. So for those that are not aware, North Carolina has a C3 table, a state voices table, where a lot of C3 organizations come together. The Council of Churches, and the Black Alliance are in partnership dynamically, but we all sit at a table of about 50 to 60 organizations that are all doing good pro-democracy work. So from New North Carolina Project to Democracy North Carolina, last year we coordinated and brought a lot of volunteers to You Can Vote and the You Can Vote efforts. We work with Kate Feldman very closely, but I want us to realize this: no community is monolithic, and particularly the Black community. We love to have a one-size-fits-all or a magic bullet approach, but that's not possible in every single community. And right now we have individuals that don't believe that democracy is still the answer for their systemic shifts that need to happen in their lives. And we have to do a lot of persuasion. There's not a one-size-fits-all approach, and we love being in community with all of these organizations. And there is no competition amongst all of us, because there's enough work with 10 million voters in this state of North Carolina. Well, actually close to 8 million registered voters in the state of North Carolina. There is more than enough work to do, but we have to make sure that we're not stepping on top of each other. We're going in communities where we are complementing each other, being in the same neighborhoods, even on a local level when we're talking about building infrastructure. And this is why we bring the churches, the Divine Nine, civic and service organizations together, because we are not talking to each other around how to engage in voter activations collectively. And so when we bring folks to the table, we're making sure we're dividing the maps to make sure that no community is not being covered in regards to voter engagement, or to really make sure that we're going in community with similar messages. But at the end of the day, we know that each organization has a specific targeted group of people that we're trying to reach. And we know for a fact that one of the things that have harmed our democracy is treating individuals as voting blocks, not as voting people. And so we know there's a bunch of different ways and are in good communication with organizations that are doing this good work. One Wake, yes, we have the churches that have been in formation with One Wake, we're talking to on an individual level. We also work with the Wake Ministries. There's a ministerial alliance in Wake. And I know a lot of folks are pointing to newer groups that are standing up in state, and we need those new groups. But don't you know, just like we go out and register voters, but every single year we're not turning out voters that are already registered, we have groups in community that have long stake in doing this organizing work. And we believe that the newer groups have a job to do. And we also recognize that the older groups that have been in community, that are trusted allies and resources for information, also have a responsibility, and we can't leave them behind too. Most of the institutions that we work with are over 150 years old in community. When we talk about HBCUs, when we talk about Black colleges in general, when we talk about churches, when we talk about these civic and service organizations, these are institutions all over 100 years old. And with a little bit of coordination and resources, they can be resurged. No one was talking about divine non-engagement or faith engagement before we saw Raphael Warnock, a pastor from Ebenezer Baptist Church, run in Georgia, until we saw Kamala Harris, a member of AKA, Alpha Kappa Alpha, one of the storied and largest Black organizations running in DC for vice president. And so these institutions are, even in the midst of the pandemic, serving as guiding lights and North Stars in community, and we invest with them as we work with the new organizations across the state. So it's a both and, it's not an either or in this situation, and we have appreciated the partnership that we have with these groups. Executive Director Copeland, I see your question. I'm going to let Reverend Fairley answer this one.
Yeah, absolutely. We definitely should work with Dr. Scream. That was one of his babies, if you will. He was really working with all of the sheriffs throughout, from Mecklenburg to Winston, to make sure that we were able to get in the jails, to make sure that everyone had a ballot to be able to vote. So that is something that we definitely can partner with Dr. Scream to make sure that we make that happen.
Am I still on mute? Am I muted? I'm not muted. Okay, good. Second Chance Alliance and Forward Justice. I want you to put those two organizations down in your note tab. Forward Justice is the organization that recently went out and won a historic victory in getting the rights restored for individuals that have felony convictions. That decision, that court decision, is now being appealed. We were proud to stand with them in that fight and still stand with them. And then we also are working with organizations like the Second Chance Alliance, who are going out across North Carolina, particularly in the metro areas where we have large prison populations, and ensuring that residents know exactly what they can do to get their rights restored in regards to voting rights. Just yesterday, I was talking to an individual that we all may know, Ms. Diana Powell, who works in Wake County as a leader in Justice Served. And she is asking us to come in with them over this summer to do a new Engaged Freedom Summer, where we are talking to individuals in our communities that typically don't get political conversations and persuasion to engage them. I will say this, can someone tell me the largest voting bloc in North Carolina? It is white women. And so in as much as we are working hard to make sure that we are pulling our communities to the table, having conversations with folks in our own backyard is the best method of making sure that we're turning this thing around. It's not going to be Black people alone that save us, and nor should we think that Black voter turnout increasing alone is going to stop the ills. When we go back to that map or the timeline that I showed you, after every forward thrust in the Black community, we see a violent response by a majority white community. So we cannot allow the Black community alone to be the scapegoat for voter engagement. We've got to get out here, talk to our cousins. We got to spend the summertime talking to our individuals that we know don't think like us and don't have the same political views. Because when we go to the polls together, Black and white, when we go to the polls together, brown and yellow and red, we make a bigger majority than the individuals that are now taking over the public discourse around democracy, around the moral majority, and around fairness. And so we're working very actively in the Black community, and we're also working with some of our white allies to have messages in rural communities talking to white voters about supporting issues that are in the Black community. And there are dozens of organizations that are helping us with that, including Council of Churches. So we're excited about the work that we are doing, and we're excited about the multiracial approach that we can have when we focus on building Black power in this way. It's not anti any community, but it is looking at the most harmed in our democracy and building a political apparatus around that reality. Perfect. And thank you for putting Second Chance Alliance in the chat and those links in the chat. Thanks so much.
Well, Director Bass and Reverend Fairley, you have given us a presentation amongst all presentations this week and interweaving the historical context and where we are in this moment right here, right now. In closing, the motto, one of the mottos of the North Carolina Council of Churches is very much what you were speaking to, which is strengthen unity, peace through justice. And that is what we are here and called to do as people of faith and conscience. So as we close out this session today, I know everyone that was here in the live session, hopefully will share this. I want as many people as possible to see this presentation, so we will work hard to get that out. We are so grateful for your leadership, and we will be in prayer for you and with you throughout this process. So if you would join us in our closing liturgy that we've been using each day throughout this session, I will read the pieces, and if you will stay on mute, but join me in voice so that you can hear the words from your own mouth in the bold. Together, let us close out this moment. God of all the ages, who has seen every nation rise and many nations fall, endow in us the wisdom necessary to be a nation that rises to your call for justice and peace. God of all truth, who sees all eternity in the blink of an eye, bestow upon us the humility to listen to those who differ from us so that we might know your truth. God of all people, who have marked each of us as holy by creating each of us in your image, impart to us the courage to create a society where each of us can flourish to the fullness of our ability. May we all take a deep breath in again. And breathe out the wholeness, love, and prayer and justice for all. Go in peace and join us tomorrow at noon. Serena Sebring will be with us, the executive director from Blueprint, North Carolina, to discuss democracy in action. May it be so. Amen. Thank you, Reverend Fairley and Director Bass.